Good evening all, and welcome. Not everything that lurks in the dark can be explained. There are creatures of the night that folk have known about since the dawn of time, and yet they seem to have never been captured, only seen by few, who are left in disbelief with their appearance. These creatures, the likes of skinwalkers, fairies, and more, are sure to astound and horrify you, for their appearance often impedes ill omen, as you will soon find out. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My friend and I were driving up to a friend's camp in Mesa Verde, Colorado. We're driving up and we go through this tunnel that has an urban legend of it being haunted. They say if you stop in the middle of the tunnel, you will see something come out of the shadows, stand in the middle of the road and stare. As you can imagine with all urban legends, my friend and I didn't believe this shit for a second. We're going through the tunnel having a good time, and we're making fun of the urban legend, saying skinwalkers are nothing but old Indian tales. We were coming out of the other end, when something runs out in front of us, and I have to slam on the brakes. I drive a Honda Civic, so my car is pretty low to the ground, but I swear that the creature's back was as tall as my windshield. It had tanned, rough skin. Not hair, skin. It stops, looks at us for roughly 15 seconds, then nonchalantly strolls to the other side of the road, where there's another creature watching, waiting for it to come to the other side. As soon as it's on the other side of the road, I hightail it up the mountain, trying to get to our friend's camp as soon as possible. My mind was so scared, I hardly got to see details, but my friend was bawling, saying it spoke to her through her eyes. She said it had a human-dog hybrid face, and it told her that it shouldn't make fun of things that she didn't understand. I'm trying to calm her down, thinking she's just freaked herself out. As I'm driving, I'm looking at the sides of the road, where I see these small creatures staring at us through the grass. They're not moving or anything, just watching. At this point, I'm starting to freak out. We get to our friend's camp, and he has a camper. Thank God I was not sleeping in a tent after all that shit. We start drinking, and eventually forget what just happened. We're all cleaning up, getting ready for bed, when we hear the loudest scream we've ever heard. It was so loud and long, I had to cover my ears. It was like a banshee getting murdered. It was the worst sound I'd ever heard in my life. We are all in the bedroom, too afraid to be by ourselves, when we hear sniffing around the camper, like a dog does when he's sniffing something out. We heard this noise for 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. We eventually got so exhausted that we passed out. The morning that we woke up, we remembered what happened and packed up all of our shit in about 10 minutes. He got his camper hooked up in 5, and it was honestly the scariest thing I had ever experienced. And I will never be visiting again, even at daytime. Don't speak upon things that you do not understand, because there's always a possibility that it exists. This takes place on Christmas night 2007, at roughly 8:30 p.m. in the evening. The day was pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, a hearty breakfast made by my father, and delicious smells from the kitchen as my parents both prepared a feast. There were visits from extended family, bringing pies and cakes for dessert. At around 2, we all sat down to eat, and then lazed about the rest of the afternoon into the evening, just talking, catching up, and doing the general Christmassy thing. After our food had managed to be partially digested, and we weren't feeling absolutely stuffed, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would take about 10 minutes, if I took the back roads to get there. So I did. It was a little past 8 p.m, and my friend lived in a housing development surrounding a private lake. You might have called it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around a lake, the roads surrounding it were in a spiral sort of shape. Those houses were sparsely positioned on the outmost parts of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together near the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached his house. His house, along with the others, were far enough apart from each other that you couldn't see them from the road as you drove by. There were either woods all around with long drives, or open fields with long drives. You could see porch lights in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour to 20. There were no street lights in the development, and for some reason, I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit, because there were so many speed bumps in place every 30 feet or so. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window slightly open, taking in some fresh air. And I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me, as I usually listened to music while driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day, although it had been fun. I reached a section of road that had barren fields on either side and woods set back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees, and as I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going at about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car and it were exactly parallel, and this is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on 2 long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light-coloured, not sure whether it was white, tan, yellow or greyish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off its back. I don't know what it was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. It had pointed things atop of its head, 2 things going straight upwards, with something mingled between the 2 things. That's what I got from a very quick scan, and from my observation of it as it neared my car. As my car became parallel to it, Within a split second, I went from looking at my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. In that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth wide open. Out came a remarkable scream that I shall never forget. Gives me the chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shriek, enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked. I continued driving and went past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened and that I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get back home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sunk in. Had my driver's side window been opened fully, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what it was. Has anyone else seen anything like this? Or heard of it? I'd love to know, because I am still in the dark. In 2010, me and two friends were driving around out of the country in Effingham, Illinois. We live about 30 minutes away from there. This was a typical weekday night, driving out to a cemetery to respectfully explore. We were told the Caspar Cemetery, deep in the woods, surrounded by caves outside of Effingham, was a really good place. We head to Effingham and stop for sodas at a gas station, and then head to the country. It's about 1 or 2 a.m, so it's dark, and I see something with yellow glowing eyes off the side of the country road, just past the ditch, in the headlights. It was too short to be a deer, but too big to be an opossum or a raccoon. As we get closer, it gets clearer, and I realize that what I am looking at is a skinny, hairless, and grey human-like thing, but definitely not human. Crazy as hell looking. It was crouched. Its arms were incredibly long, and looked like it could have been 7 feet tall, or perhaps more, while standing. I could feel myself. My heart got cold, and it began to race as the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had no idea what I was staring at, but I was feeling the most pure and rawest fear I had ever felt. I was just taking in the situation and kind of whispered to myself, "What the hell?" And then I heard my friend Harley in the back seat shout, "What the hell is that?" Complete shock and terror set in, and I can't make a sound. I'm just staring at it. By the time we are right in front of it, passing it, it just watches us drive by, and it sinks back into the darkness from whence it came. Then we all start screaming, literally freaking the hell out. I was convinced it was a demon for months, but still doubted myself seeing it, thinking that my mind had played a trick on me. We didn't even make it to the Caspar that night. We went straight home, and I couldn't sleep. 6 months later, I'm at a different friend's house, and she gets a text from her cousin. She sends me this strange picture of a creature, and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight, and I went cold. I was seeing this thing again. I knew we weren't crazy, that there was something to this. He said he caught it on his trail camera one town over. He told us later it wasn't his camera, but that he was just pranking us, but nonetheless, I immediately recognized it. I asked her to send me the picture, and I sent it to Harley, and he quickly replies, recognizing the thing that we saw that night. After a while of investigation, I found out that the picture was faked, but still can't help but have my doubts. I researched the pictures of demons to try and find some answer, and nothing. Fast forward to October 2012, and I'm on Facebook, and I come across a page called Weird Effingham, Illinois. So of course I start combing through the entire page, and I find reports of sightings around the cemetery of creatures with glowing eyes. Nothing as in depth as what I saw, but still enough to tell me that we were not the only ones who must have seen something out there. I researched demons and paranormal stuff for some time, but found nothing. 2 years after that, I'm scrolling through my Facebook feed again, and then comes the infamous faked picture. One girl I know posted it on the wall of another girl, so I immediately commented my story on it. When I got up to the previous comments, I see one of the girls were talking about seeing it as well. She replied to my comment and told me that she had seen it in the country in Effingham too, back in 2011. This guy we went to school with commented on the status too, and said that he had a friend that was super into the occult, and that she said they're called ghouls. So I went right into researching ghouls. What I found blows my freaking mind. Lore says they are cave dwellers, and, as I previously mentioned, Caspar Cemetery is surrounded by caves. They feed on the freshly dead, and normally stay close to cemeteries to be within close proximity of their food source. They've been known to show themselves to humans when trying to get close to them to eat them, when freshly deceased bodies are scarce. I went to images, and I could only find some illustrations, but they look exactly like what I saw that night. Everything I was reading was falling perfectly into place, and lined up perfectly with my experience. I couldn't explain it away. Then last night, I came across a Reddit post with a similar story to mine, in such detail. This is one of the most incredible things that has ever happened to me, and I will always search for more answers. This encounter took place in the winter of 2016 in Davies County, Indiana. It was around 8 o'clock and very dark outside. I was just out feeding my goats as per my routine. The goat shed was around 300 yards away from my home. To get to the shed, I had to cross 2 small fields and walk along a narrow path through the woods. These woods border an Indiana naval facility. After I had finished, I began to walk back. I had crossed one field and was about halfway through the narrow path when I started to hear rustling in the underbrush. All I had with me was a little flashlight that only shined about 10 feet in front of me. I was almost to the end of the path when I spotted something. It was on all fours, with a bony frame, elongated limbs, and pale skin. While the first part of that description sounds pretty generic, it did seem to have a long and highly flexible neck. Not long after I noticed, it seemed to notice me, and bolted down the path. It ran, almost scuttling into the second field. This field had a small hill in the center. This thing fled, and disappeared over one side. I ran as fast as I could around the other side of the small hill, and zigzagged back to my house, where I quickly locked all the doors. This thing was terrifying, but it seemed watchful more than anything, for now at least. In about 2012, my then boyfriend lived in Sweden, and I lived in Canada. He came to visit me, and during one of the evenings, I woke up to something strange perched at the foot of my bed. It was a pale, thin, humanoid figure. It was completely hairless, and the legs seemed to be bowed in some way. It seemed to walk on all fours despite looking human. I couldn't see much of its face, since it was looking away from me. It looked a lot like the creature from the fictional story, The Rake. When I gasped, it hopped off the bed and into the darkness. My partner heard me and woke up to ask me what was wrong. I didn't tell him, as not to alarm him while trying to rest. In 2014, he was visiting once more, and we were once again in bed sleeping. I woke up to hear my boyfriend screaming like I'd never heard him before. I immediately turned on the light and shook him to try and snap him out of it, but he just screamed and then cried. After 30 minutes or so, he finally was calm enough to explain what had happened. Apparently he woke up to a pale humanoid figure with a gaping mouth and black, sunken eyes, basically on top of him. As he screamed, the figure slowly backed itself into the closet, while staring at him the whole time, and crawling on all fours. I felt sick. I never ever told him about what I saw a few years ago, and there's no way he could have known, and described what I saw perfectly like that. Now here's why I'm posting. It showed up again. My ex messaged me today, as we're still friends, and told me that his now girlfriend has seen what he refers to as the Pale Man. They were asleep, and apparently she woke up to see this thing stalking around the room, and it noticed her frozen in fear, so it crawled up next to her. My ex woke up and tried to console her, and she was describing what she saw. It apparently was a perfect match to the thing we both saw. I only ever told him what I saw after his experience, and she had never heard of either of our experiences. Is this just a mass coincidence of hallucinating while waking up? Is it a demon of some sort? A haunting? A skinwalker? I have no clue. But I am legitimately freaked out. I lost a lot of time once. It's one of a few very creepy things to happen to me. But this one really got to me, and still does. It only happened a few months ago. I went for a walk with my mother on a local path, around a fairly large hill, a regular pastime of ours. We walked the 2 miles from the car to the hill, before beginning our ascent to reach the loop, which is only about a half-mile encircling the peak. We're from the area, and have always known that people have become wildly lost up there, even though the path is the only one around the hill. It's sort of very specific knowledge. If you go 10 miles away, no one will know about it. We had been dozens of times before, with the dogs usually, but today it was just my mum and I. We had never been lost before. So, we've been walking for I don't know how long, when I noticed something odd. The sun was in the same place to us as it had been for however long we'd been walking, on a circular path. It should have appeared to have moved as we changed directions. We should have also been reaching the point where you headed down the hill, but our path was completely level. I was taught to use the sun and other natural signs to navigate, as I spend a lot of time just wandering, whether on horseback or on foot. At that point I realized I had no recollection of that part of the path and had been walking along in silence. Well, here's the weird bit. Out came my phone and it showed me the time was 2:37. I had absolutely no signal, even though it's usually spot on up there. We had set off at 11 in the morning, and all the hairs on my body stood up. This was a short walk, an hour and a half at most, and leaving the car and getting back to it included. The sun should have been above us, but it was sat off to where it would have said 3 o'clock for that time of year. I remember the time because when I turned to ask my mum what time she had, she looked straight through me like I wasn't there, and remained like that for a whole 3 minutes. She was just staring off into space and to her left. Then at 2:40 she suddenly came to life. I had moved away at that point, too nervous to remain under her gaze like that. After about a minute of saying, "Mum," and nudging her in the rigid shoulder, in a building childlike panic, even though I was 20, I sat on a log just off the path, getting pretty freaked out. My mum glanced around and said in a hollow, weird voice, "I think the fairies might have us. We need to keep walking." I scrambled up and fell in to match her determined strides on this unfamiliar path. Why fairies, Mum? Why say that? I wasn't raised to see them as little cutesy people with wings, you see. To me, they're straight out of nightmares, because my mother's upbringing said that's what they were. Creatures out to confuse and trick. What time does your watch say, Mum? She always wears a battery-operated analog watch, and she lifts up her wrist. 2:45. She puts her wrist down and lifted it up again to check. That's not right. I just shook my head. All right, keep walking. So we did. We trudged on through this unfamiliar woodland for what I would have said felt like half an hour. It never turned a corner or changed elevation. I knew we were in bother when my stalwart, never frightened of anything mother, began to get nervous. So in response to her nerves, she became pissed off. She steeled herself, lifted those proud, all-seeing gypsy eyes to the creepy atmosphere, and spoke as she would to a lurking person. "Who's toying with us? Put us back!" There was what I can only describe as a burst of deep laughter from the path behind us, and we spun around to face it. We were at the top of a hill that led to the gate out of there. It was at the fork where you can go either left or right, neither of which I remember choosing, even though we always made a decision of it. We made our own way down the slope and out of the woods as calmly as possible, and got back to the car, which was parked next to an ancient church cemetery. The time in the car? 5:12. We should have got back to the car no later than maybe 1:45 if the walk had gone normally, or just after 4 when our watch and phones said we were approaching 3. We lost nearly 5 hours. I've had a lot of creepy stuff happen to me, but this is about the worst. I wasn't alone. It was the middle of the day on a usually familiar path. Where did those hours go? Where was that path? So many unanswerable questions. I even went up there one day alone just to see if I could experience it again, but nothing happened. I am a 27-year-old male, living in North Texas where I was born. I am a very practical person, even though I was raised Christian. You know, the South. But I also believe in the existence of magic and the supernatural. I had grown up with ghosts and such in my home, and had a brief and terrifying experience with witchcraft, and even learned a form of martial art that incorporated principles of spiritual energy from a friend in high school who I'd seen perform inhuman acts of strength and speed. All my life, I have researched myths and histories of the supernatural from all over the world. By the time the new year rolled around, I had started dating my ex-girlfriend from high school. Jane and I had made plans to move into a new apartment with her and her 4-year-old son, Jonathan. It was a little rushed, but her lease was up, and she needed to get away from Jonathan's sociopathic and abusive father. I could go on about him, but it's irrelevant to the rest of the story, and honestly, he's not worth the words I've given him. What is relevant is the background of Jane and our history together. I was 6 foot, 250 pounds, and naturally strong, and what every parent wished for in their daughter's boyfriend. I was also totally clueless when it came to women. I had a lot of beautiful female friends who I'm now sure would have killed for a shot with me, and I even had crushes on a few of them, but had always assumed they would shoot me down. Jane was a year behind me, and had separate classes for students with mental illness that made it hard for them to be among the general class population. So it was pure chance when I met her in a pep rally. She usually wouldn't go to them, but it was required for her to attend such events at least once a semester in order to socialize in a way she normally wouldn't. I fell for her instantly, and after only 1 week of daily phone calls, she agreed to be my girlfriend, and I began spending every spare moment I could with her. I would run to her section of the campus between every class, just to spend less than a minute holding her hand or hugging her. I spent every weekend at her house, and of course, it was mostly in her bedroom. We would drive around the dark country roads at night and talk about our supernatural experiences, and I learnt about her unique family history. Generations ago in Wales, where her family originated from, one of her ancestors made a pact with a powerful fae. The fae are basically fairies and elves and such. They take many forms, and the different kinds have different powers and properties. The fairy promised her ancestors power, fortune, health, beauty, and intellect, not only for them, but for their descendants. But in exchange, the fairy and its descendants would exchange any of their own sickly young as a changeling for a healthy human child. The sickly fairy baby would appear to be normal, but would without fail succumb to severe illness quickly and die. Fairies, though, are not to be trusted, and in every historical account, every gift they offer would be tainted with something terrible. Information, she explained, that most of her family, at least those on her father's side, were indeed all of those things, but they were also mad. Members of her family that would seem to be blessed would often develop mental illness and in some cases become suicidal. Her father, who had been a botanist and professor at the local community college, had become obsessed with research of plants that could, according to mythology, repel fairies and demons, but ultimately illegally purchased a firearm and shot himself in the head. In addition to this, her family did indeed have a high rate of infant deaths from otherwise treatable sicknesses or congenital defects without any explanation. All of this concerned me, as Jane had been honest about her mental condition. She had crippling anxiety and depression, as well as seeing a demon woman who called herself Georgia and told Jane that she was worthless and she should kill herself, which she had attempted before. I felt confident that, with my knowledge of the supernatural and my teenage ability to be immortal, sarcasm, and told her I would always be there for her and would never let anything happen to her. Our relationship continued to become more intense during the summer break, and there were very few days I did not spend with Jane either in my arms or at my side. There were so many that we would sit on the sofa with a movie or show playing as her head rested on my lap and my fingers couldn't keep themselves out of her beautiful red hair. With all this extra time came more bad days too. Some days I would show up at her house and she would beg me to leave her because she didn't deserve to be happy, or I deserved better. There were others when things would be fine all day, until I noticed it was too warm for her to be wearing a sweater, and I would clean the bandages of her cuts. The worst days were the rare times that some chore or family event kept her. She would call my house endlessly all day until I came home to find messages filling the phone to the point it wouldn't record anymore. She insisted I had been avoiding her because I hated her, or that I had been with another girl. When I finally called, she would either be crying so much I couldn't understand, and I would immediately leave and walk to her house to comfort her and reassure her of my feelings for her, or she would be enraged to the point I didn't recognize her voice and tell me to leave her alone and then hang up. I had learnt to leave her alone, as she asked, but would call her mother just to check. It wasn't before long that the nightmares began. Every time she had a bad day, I would have the same vivid dream that night. When I say vivid, you need to understand most dreams that seem real when you're having them are still fuzzy around the edges and are obviously dreams. These were crisp, clear and perfect dreams, and I would wake up in my bed with the feeling of dread that only people who have thought they were going to die can understand, and my door would open. From the darkness of the hallway, the thing would call through to the top of my doorway on the ceiling. It was a young woman that looked exactly like Jane, except her skin was black scales, her eyes blood red from edge to edge, and elongated fingers ending in thin claws. She would crawl until she was directly above me and drop down on me, pinning me to the bed, the way an enthusiastic lover might. Her hands wrapped around my wrists and her hips situated on top of mine, as she would look at me like she either wanted to eat or rape me, maybe both. She would torment me and say terrible things about Jane, and that I should leave her and let the bitch kill herself. As I screamed internally, unable to make my body move after scratching and jabbing for what felt like hours, she would disappear, after whispering something like, "One day I'll be able to kill you." And I would wake up with aches and pains, but wrote it off as stress. Our relationship followed this pattern for almost 3 years. At the start of my senior year, I got a job and was doing extra schoolwork to make sure I would graduate. The less time I spent with her, the more I started to realize I couldn't do it anymore. She was getting worse, and I was falling apart. I felt that if I continued this way, things would get really bad. Halfway through the school year, I decided I just had to be honest with her. We met outside school at the end of the day, and I sat down at a picnic table. I knew I needed to be clear about what I was saying and stand my ground, no matter how emotional things got. So I told her I wasn't strong enough to hold her up, and that I needed to get out before it was too late. She took it really well. In fact, she didn't even seem fazed. I'm an idiot. She had blocked out everything I said. She told me she understood, and that it was okay to have a break from time to time, and that she would be there when I was ready. She stood up, kissed my forehead, and walked off, saying, "Gotta go, love you, honey." And that was before I could get a word out. The next week was hell. She would drive by my house and ask if I was home, and if my family said no or told her to leave, she would just glare and drive away without a word. Whenever I would coincidentally run into her, I would try to make her understand, which started her fighting and accusing me of cheating on her. Fast forward 2 weeks, and I'm at work and had actually been hanging out with a female co-worker, but I wasn't ready to move any further yet. She was flirting with me as we worked the drive-through window together, and Jane walks into the door flinging it open, yelling at me in front of this girl, my boss, other co-workers, and a building full of customers. I walked away and asked my boss for an early break in order to deal with this. She told me it was fine, but if I didn't have her out in 10 minutes, she was calling the cops. I sat her down at the booth in the back, and as kindly as I could, told her that we were through, and that I couldn't be with her at all, and I wanted her to seek treatment because I still loved her and was scared for her. I can't tell you the guilt in my heart when I watched her storm out. I had told her so many times that I would always be there, that I would solve all her problems, and she trusted me, but I had nothing left inside. It had been too much for an overworked teenager, but all I could think about was how I failed the girl I loved. I finished my shift that night, like an emotionless robot, and went home without another word. My brain screamed at me all night at how pathetic and shitty I was. I went straight to bed and cried myself to sleep like I'd never cried before. I woke up that night feeling the same crushing fear as before, but didn't see anything. The door didn't open, and nothing crawled on my ceiling. I started to sit up when it suddenly crept from the darkness and pinned me down again. It slapped me hard across the face and said, "You had this coming a long time. Now you die." I had began screaming and feebly thrashing about on my bed. The thing raised its hand and drew its fingers together, forming a claw into a single sharp spike. Just as it began to thrust its arm forward, my stepdad heard me calling and burst in to wake me from my nightmare. We sat in the kitchen for about an hour drinking coffee and talking about what I'd done and been through the day, and he had some great advice. But the whole time, I was distracted by the realization that he hadn't woke me up. The thing disappeared as he opened my door, and I was able to move again. And I'd been awake the entire time, and can only conclude that I was insane. I never told him the true nature of the incident, and when he left for work, I went back to bed but with the lights on. Over time, I never did recover and get over her, but never forgot what she still meant to me. Fast forward 8 years, and here we are living together, When we reconnected, she had told me that she had received treatment and counselling, and it had worked. Little did I know how good she was at faking sanity. When we moved in together, her belongings stacked halfway to the ceiling, and they filled the living room, which was quite large for an apartment, about 13 by 10 feet. But she assured me that they would be unpacked and put away soon. It started small at first. I would come home from working overtime 6 days a week, just so that we could afford the rent, to find out that her anxiety and depression had kept her bound to the bed. The apartment became worse the longer it went on, because she couldn't bring herself to clean up or do the dishes. I didn't blame her at first, but rather tidied up and got Jonathan and myself ready for bed. I began to bond with Jonathan throughout the time we were together. So much so that after a month he called me Daddy, and it was the most glorious feeling. I loved him more than I had ever loved anything in my entire life, and would have killed anyone who threatened him. Things continued this way for a while, until the stress of being overworked at my job and my home pushed things over the edge. I started to resent her for never once trying to overcome her illness, even though she admitted that she was seeing Georgia when I wasn't home. I was always supportive and even tried to get her to see a counselor again, but she never did. I started to blame her because she had the means to do better, but chose to give in to her illness because it was easier. That may have been the case, but I should have tried harder to get her to try, instead of saying all of the things to her face. We had begun fighting pretty regularly, and when I got home from work late at night, she would no longer be awake to greet me, but just go to bed and would simply clean up until about 2 a.m. and fall into my side of the bed and face the wall. There were good days too, when we would spend all our time together and enjoy every second of it. We would come home together in the evening and put Jonathan to bed together, and then spend the night in each other's arms. But it could not last forever. On the nights I would be cleaning up things, it started to become strange. I felt watched, and even hunted in my own apartment. I would see shadows darting in and out of corners, and after a few more weeks, I started to become angry all the time, and our fighting became more frequent, though, thank God, I never laid a hand on her. I even started having multiple panic attacks a day, and seeing the shadows at work and everywhere else. Eventually I stopped cleaning, and would simply come home late, because I had begun smoking again, and tried to hide it. I would walk around the block smoking, and then come home, take a shower, brush my teeth, and climb into bed. It was one of those nights when I woke in the middle of the night to see the goddamn lizard woman that I hadn't seen since before I graduated high school. It didn't crawl, but this time rather stood at the foot of my bed, and appeared to have changed somewhat. It was moments before I realized that it had grown and aged to resemble Jane, not as she was long ago, but as she was now, an adult. It seemed to be waiting for me to remember, and when it saw the recognition in my eyes, it grinned and leaned down to crawl all over my body. Now, we're almost done, so hang on, okay? I should mention at this point, I had dabbled a lot more in forms of magic and researched into demons and ghosts and other creatures, and what to do about them. The other thing is, I have no chill. To put it simply, when it comes to fight or flight, I am fight, and as I said, I'm 6 foot and 255 pounds, and I've only gotten stronger over the years, if not a little sore in the back and knees. What it must have failed to see in my eyes was rage. The thing was back and was threatening not one, but two people I loved. I began focusing energy in my body as she pinned me down and said, "Let's finish what we started, honey." I groaned back and said, "Bring it on, bitch," and it didn't seem to like me talking back. It raised its hand to strike me, and I pushed through the force holding me down and planted the fist of my non-dominant hand in its face and channeled all the power I could muster into my hands. I reeled back, and I didn't let up, striking out again with my dominant hand, and followed through as though I was punching smoke. All of a sudden, I was punching smoke. It vanished as soon as I struck it a second time, and Jane had woken up. She was distraught and terrified, but strangely, she was also apologetic. After we calmed down, I asked her why she was apologizing, and she said, "It's my fault Georgia came for you. I can't stop her." I was in disbelief. How was this possible? How did I have an encounter with her delusion? She went to the closet and came back with a box. It was a box I recognized. It was her files from a mental institution from when she was 12. As part of her therapy, someone had asked her to draw Georgia, and she was a talented artist. Despite having the features of a young teenager, it was definitely the damned lizard bitch. I realized that I could not have known this. She never allowed me to see the contents of the box before, and I respected her rights to privacy. This meant that Georgia wasn't a delusion. She was a demonic entity that was likely bound to the Fae and their curse. Things got much worse in the following weeks, and I began to fall apart. I eventually came home hours later one night, and she had been waiting up and was freaking out. I told her I couldn't do it anymore. She refused to get the help she needed and even used Georgia as an excuse, because she's real, which means that she isn't crazy. This of course disregarded her other excuse, but it somehow made sense to her. We talked for some time, as I packed my bags and kissed her goodnight. On my way out I said, "I never stopped loving you back then, and I never will." I had been staying at my mother's house for a few days, while she had arranged to move into a house her stepfather had purchased, as he's loaded. When she called me late one night, crying, she said that Georgia was trying to make her kill herself. She had cut a bit with a pair of scissors to make her go away, but it didn't work, and now she wanted to hurt Jonathan as well. And I was already in the car, while I had my little brother on the phone with the police. She eventually hung up on me, and I stepped on the gas, and I made my way from the next county over, so fast that I arrived there at the same time as 2 police officers and a social worker. The next morning, she was in a hospital, and her mother was on her way from South Texas to pick up Jonathan. He and I cried as I put his car seat in his grandmother's car and buckled him in, and I never saw him again. When Jane got out of the hospital, I picked her up and we talked a lot. As we picked up her new meds, and I dropped her off at the apartment where her family was waiting, and already had her stuff moved out. It took a long time to get over it, and even now I have nightmares about horrible things happening to Jonathan. The last one was quite recent. I woke up and felt compelled to check the porch, where I found Jonathan's purple bloated corpse staring up at me from the doormat. I realize he isn't my biological son, but he will always be my child. The parents listening will understand how I feel, and if you don't, imagine the best moments with your children, the nights when they fall asleep before you can get them into bed, and you hold them in your arms, reveling in their purity, trying to memorize their scent. The first time they say, "I love you," and you feel as though you've been given a heavenly gift. Now imagine having them forcibly ripped from your arms and told they don't exist anymore. To make matters worse, I never saw Georgia again after that night, but I do have a demon of my own now. I began seeing that the day after the night, and it may look like me, but I don't know. He wears a black leather cloak with a large hood, and I can only see red piercing eyes. It has never said anything about suicide, but it does insult and degrade me, whilst trying to convince me to massacre random innocents. He says if I let him take control, I'll become powerful and have whatever I want. Jane, I doubt you're listening, but if you are, I changed some details to protect you and Jonathan, but I think you'll know. I'm sorry for my part in everything, and I'm working on a way of getting things figured out. If I'm ever successful, I'll find you and help you in a way I couldn't before, and possibly save Jonathan from the curse of your family in the process. This happened when I was 17. I'm 32 now. I graduated high school and got my first apartment in a nice town. I lived by myself and my cat, Snowball. Don't laugh. I named her when I was 8 years old. Here are a few details before we get started. I've never been a fan of cat boxes. Worst part of being a cat owner is shoveling tiny shit with a tiny shovel every day. So I got one of those motion-activated self-scooping deals. Let it on the back patio, ran the cord inside to power it, and left the back sliding door open big enough for her to get in and out of. The patio is one of those 8x8 cement floored types surrounded by a 5-foot tall wooden fence. If you looked out of my bedroom door, you'd be facing right at the sliding door with hanging blinds, living room in between, and a kitchen that's far off to the right. So I'm playing some 56k Counter-Strike at the computer in my room, with my back facing the door. It's around midnight, and I hear Snowball start to make one of those awful cat growling noises in the back of her throat. I'm pretty locked onto the game, so I tell her to knock it off, while not looking at her. She keeps doing it, and I tell her to shut up. I'm irritated, because I'm doing well in the round. She gets louder. This is enough to break me from my gaming zone, and I realize this is not normal. I get up from my computer to see her standing in the doorway facing out, her back to me. She is on full Halloween cat mode, hair sticking straight out, her back is completely arched, and she looks tense. I'd never seen her that way. She is still just looking crazy. I look out the living room window where she's facing. Nothing is amiss. There's nothing there. I look down at her to say something to the effect of, "What's the matter?" And she makes this insane sound, like a combination of a hiss and a growl and a spit, as she starts to take a few steps back. This is when a tiny creature runs out of the kitchen on 2 legs, wearing a tattered piece of cloth or a bag. It looked like a little cloak, and it was about 1 foot or 1.5 feet tall. It is a real-life jump scare. The cat jumps backwards about 3 feet in the air, and I jump. I glance down at her as she does, but this thing quickly looks back up. I hear her land with a crash behind me, and run. I'm fixated on the thing. It's moving, but it's like time has slowed down. Now I'm watching these things happen, but everything is so fast. It runs out of the back door, through the blinds with a crash at high speed that doesn't seem natural. The blinds are swinging, my heart is pounding, and I stand there dumbfounded. What the hell did I just see? I'm staring at the back patio door and at the swinging blinds. I'm not moving. My eyes start to notice that something is wrong. All the blinds are softly swinging, except the two closest to the opening. I see they're making an inverted V. I look at them and follow them down to the very bottom, and in between them I see it. Its head is poking through the blinds, staring at me. It has yellow eyes and a face that I can only describe as bestial. Grey, greenish, blackish skin. At this point, a singular loud thought fills my mind. You aren't supposed to see this. And, at the conclusion of that, every one of my hanging blinds shoots upwards and outwards. I jump again, and my heart tries to blast out of my chest. Some of them hitting the ceiling, a few fall off. It is a loud racket, and the rest are swinging all over the place. I look at the place where its face was, and it was gone. I beeline for the kitchen. Refrigerator door is open, and I open a drawer and grab the biggest knife I see. I'm shaking. Adrenaline, like I have never experienced before. I rush to the sliding door and slam it shut, and it won't close. I open it a bit more and slam it back again, and it still won't close. I am completely stupid. The cat box called. I crouch down, brandishing this knife like a complete idiot, looking out at the glass door, waiting for this thing to launch at my face. I'm shaking. I reach across myself with my left hand to the power plug on the wall, to the right as I stare out, waiting to stab anything that approaches. I fumble to get it unplugged. My hands won't do anything right. I finally get the cord unplugged, and I open the door really quick, to throw the cord outside. I throw it like a spaz, and it hits the wall on the side of the door and falls down. Still inside. Shit. I pick it up and try again, and this time it lands outside. I hear a scratching sound, and my eyes dart up. I see two tiny, awful hands holding onto the fence. Clawed, gnarly, humanoid hands. The thing climbed down feet first, hanging from the fence. It would have been slightly comical if it wasn't so bloody terrifying. The hands let go, and I hear it land in the bushes outside the fence, and I hear the fast footsteps as it runs off. I slam the door shut and lock it. This is completely true. I've heard it all. It was a raccoon. It was a cat that managed to get trapped in a paper bag. And it was not either of those things. After the event, I started researching like a madman. Closest thing I found was in a book I found in the library called The Fairies, which is like an art form featuring all different types of Irish folk creatures. I don't live in Ireland. I live in the US on the West Coast. You don't believe this story, and I don't blame you. It sounds ridiculous. You probably shouldn't believe it. I absolutely hate no sleep. I think it's stupid. I hate bullshit paranormal stories. Believe it or not, I am a skeptic. I believe all people that have experienced something strange or believe in the paranormal should be skeptic. I enjoy debunking paranormal videos and pictures. I want the truth. Was I hallucinating? It's entirely possible that I had an extreme and sudden hallucination. It's not unheard of. But that doesn't account for my cat freaking out and reacting at all the appropriate moments. So, there's that. This event had a huge impact on my life and completely affected the way I view the world. The paranormal, religion, everything. I was driving a truck and trailer up what was a little more than a dirt road, coming out of Lithgow in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. The road wound its way past the State Mine Museum and off deeper into the backcountry to an area that has a managed forest. So one side of the road is just a dense Aussie bush, and the other side was row upon row of managed forest. Creepy as hell even in the daytime. I had delivered the small bulldozer on the truck to a logging site and was on my way back towards Lithgow when I ran out of driving hours, so I pulled over for a nap. It would have been around 1 or 2 in the morning when I woke up and dragged my sorry ass into the driver's seat to fill my logbook. I had left the interior light off because it was a full moon and there was more than enough light to work with. As I was filling in my log, I noticed a man coming out of the mangled forest on the opposite side of the road, maybe 100 meters further down. I figured if he needed help, he would come over to the truck, and I went back to resume my paperwork. You know that feeling you get when something is not right, and the hair stands up on the back of your neck? I got that. Upon looking up again, I noticed the man was right in front of my truck, probably only a few feet away. But what struck me was the size. To put into context, I had the perfect size reference. The hood of my truck is about 6 foot 6 inches off the ground, and it barely came up to this thing's chest. It seemed curious about what this massive thing was doing in its territory, and was peering straight at me through the windshield. I had one of those fight or flight moments, and instead of sitting still, I slammed on the starter button and hit every light the truck had. High beams, spotlights, everything. The old Mac was air start, so it screamed like a banshee and then roared as I started revving it to get it back in the air so that I can get the brakes and leave. The creature did the most human-like thing I've ever seen. It stepped back from this roaring thing and raised its hand. And it was a hand up to shield its eyes from the lights. Its eyes glowed red, like a cat's do when you hit them with light, and it took off into the scrub on the side of the road. I got the hell out of there and didn't even bother with a walk-around inspection, because there was no damn way I was getting out of that truck until I got back to the lights of town. I've been back there once since then. A couple of friends and I were down that way, and we drove up that road to have a poke around, look at the ruins of the mining industry and that sort of thing. And I still felt uneasy about being there, but thankfully I didn't see the Yowie creature again. I have a story that happened to me and my friend. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout / camping trip. There were 20 or 30 of us, and we were in a little cabin thing with windows on the front and back, and a front and back door. There were little wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin, with the bathroom, was about 1/8 of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. There was obviously a buddy system, because it's Boy Scouts. So it's around midnight, and everyone has been telling scary, boring scary stories anyway, like normal camping trips. Well, I had to go to the bathroom, and asked my friend to come along. He said sure, and he got our knives. We knew that there would be bears in the woods, and it made us feel safer. Well, we went to the bathroom and began our walk back. This is where it got scary. I felt an instinctual fear. I looked to my friend, and he has the same look as me. We begin to walk a little faster, and unfold our pocket knives. I then turn around and see it. It looked similar to a cat, but it was 6 feet tall and was on its hind legs and kind of hunched over. I freaked the heck out and started running. My friend sees it too, and we sprint back to the cabin. It began making a moaning and howling noise, and it was somewhere in between the two, and followed us, slowly. We pound on the door, and the guys let us in. We tell them what we saw, and they actually believe us. So we lock the front door, and look at the back door. It had no lock. We pushed a table up against it, and had a kid there with his knife for safety. We drew the blinds on all the windows that had them, as one of them didn't, and we sat there with all the lights on. Then we see the eyes outside the windows without blinds. We were all shitting ourselves, and the thing slowly walked to the back door. We heard it bump up against it, maybe trying to open it, we think. It then left, but we still thought we were going to die. No one slept. When the adults came to wake us up, we told them, and they laughed and said that we were making it up. We know it happened, even if they didn't believe us. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Cryptid Stories has been something I've been meaning to do for a while. I really wanted to do a video just on fairies, but those stories are notoriously difficult to find, and it would have been very short, which I know isn't something you guys are into. But anyway, I really hope you liked the video. I was really happy with the stories, and I just hope that you liked them too. If you did, what would be absolutely fantastic is if you left that like and subscribed for even more content every day. You can hit that little bell icon to be notified every time I upload, which is usually the same time every night. But still useful so you never miss a post for fresh horrors every night. If there's a story that you would like to share with me to hopefully be read and featured on the channel, all that you need to do is send it to me via email, and I should hopefully do it, so long as you put in a lot of description, punctuation and paragraphing, as those are the 3 main points into making the story easy to read and more enjoyable for the listener. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Be careful with the fairies, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.